Right. Hi, everybody. That was awkward. It was in the wrong account. Always something. But it's okay. We've got the great Heather Cox Richardson with us today, and it is a banner time in the life of this American democracy. Thanks a lot for being with us today. Heather Cox Richardson, you may know her well. You may be one of the hundreds of thousands who get her daily newsletter on Substack, where she is the #1 author in the world. Letters from an American has followed for more than a year the travails and trials and historical context for what we've been going through in this country. And we've been going through a lot. She is a professor of history at Boston College, historian, author, a kind of chronicler of what we've been going through, of a kind that's rare and wonderful. She writes from Maine. If you follow her, you know that. You see her wonderful photographs, or the one photograph she puts up on her days off, which are rare indeed. And she's with us right now. Heather Cox Richardson, come to Earth with us. And for listeners and viewers, I'm sorry we came on late here, just a little technical issue. Heather, hi, we did it.
How are you, Tom? It's good to see you.
It's great to see you. Thank you so much for doing this. We first talked almost a year ago with my great friend and co-pilot of the podcast, Swing State, with you. And then again in the middle of last year, we talked. And here we are. What a year this has been. How are you feeling at the end of this week, Heather Cox Richardson, about the viability of our American democracy?
Well, as I've always said, this is the start of something. It's not the end of something. And, you know, it's one of those things that I think that most people recognize, where we now all recognize that we have a problem. And that, to me, is always the big step, is recognizing that you got to fix something. And once you've fixed it, then you actually have the pleasure of getting to rebuild something new. And I find that process very exciting. And one of the things that I've been trying to focus on for people is the difference between having and doing. You know, it's a lovely thought to think we have a terrific country where everything is great, but it's also a terrific thought to think we could build something, that democracy is a verb as much as it is a noun. And I find that very exciting. And I feel like that's the place we are right now.
Heather, be honest with us. A couple of weeks ago, when the mob, the insurrectionists, were coming through the windows and doors and you name it of the Capitol building, how close do you think we came to losing it on that day? Were we 45 seconds from seeing violence on the floor of Congress against members of Congress, against the vice president? Were we 45 seconds from losing American democracy?
Well, I think we're 45 seconds away. I think it's 85 is actually the number that I've seen. 85 seconds away from seeing bloodshed, yes. Would that have killed American democracy? I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to think about is that at that moment, and it was a moment that I really think was designed and instigated by the former president of the United States, the next 3 members in order of succession were in that building.
They were all there and in close proximity.
And that's the only time that happens. I mean, aside from an inauguration or something, they really chose that moment very carefully. But what would that look like? So what would that, and this is what people always say, oh, this is going to happen. I think, well, tell me what that looks like. Does that mean that if in fact there had been violence, that the entire country would have said, oh, okay, we're going to go ahead and turn this over to and leave Donald Trump in charge? The answer to that is no. What that would have looked like, though, would have been a very long, protracted struggle in which there would have been a contest over who was a legitimate lawmaker and what had legitimately happened to the government. I don't think, that it would have been possible really to take America by storm and launch a coup that would have succeeded. I think there would have been a really bad time. So the fact that didn't make it is vital. I also think, though, that like I say, that too was the start and not the end of something. You can see it already in the Congress, where there is a huge push in the House of Representatives to get rid of Republican conference chair Liz Cheney for voting to impeach the president. And the very fact that any of our lawmakers are standing behind an attack on our Congress is unconscionable. So we're at the beginning of something, not the end of it.
But when you put it that way, I mean, we like to think automatically when you say we're at the start of something new, that it's the start of something beautiful. But we've still got Congress people, men and women, who voted against our electoral process there. who are looking to boot Liz Cheney because she stood up for it. Are we at the start of a renaissance or further civil conflict?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, but see, let me put again a positive spin. And I know I'm a glass half full kind of person,
I'm all for it.
But, you know, we live in a democracy. We get to choose what the future looks like. And, you know, one of the things that I've been pondering a lot, and I haven't written about it, but I've been pondering a lot, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's statement at the very end of the former administration, in which he said that multiculturalism was a poison and it was not who we are and all sorts of things. And again, what does that look like? I mean, literally, what does that look like? How do you turn a nation that is built from immigrants and immigration into something that's a white nationalist country? I mean, the only way you could possibly do it is with enormous amounts of force. Do we really have the stomach for that? And the answer, I would hope, is no. So I look at that and sort of wonder, I wonder a lot about the way that we will think about this period. And it may be that from a long vantage point, we will see the previous 4 years as a backlash against an inevitable change that was going to happen one way or another. I guess we'll see, but that's what we get to do for the next rest of our lives, you and me, Tom.
Yeah, a more active engagement with democracy than we've maybe ever known in our lifetimes. I mean, there have been people in the streets in this country again and again and again through its history. But in my lifetime, I don't ever remember a time when the fate of the democracy itself was something that seemed up for grabs. And it did there for a breathtaking, terrifying, infuriating moment. Is there precedent? Is there precedent for that? For the idea that somehow either a mob or an armed group of some kind would disrupt the American democracy in such a way that it would be thrown off the rails, Heather?
Well, an armed mob, maybe not, but the idea that American democracy was in serious danger of going off the rails, absolutely. And as you said that, I wonder if one of the reasons that I'm able to keep somewhat of an even keel is because I spend so much time in the 19th century. You know, those people who lived back then are very real to me. You know, you read somebody's papers, you read somebody's books, you read all that, they really do become real to you in the way that a character in a novel would, or maybe even some of your loved ones or former neighbors or whatever. You know those people, even if you never actually met in real life. And certainly in the 19th century, the existence of America as a continuing operation was absolutely up for grabs. And I don't just mean during the 1850s when the elite Southern slaveholders took over the country and tried to turn it into an oligarchy, or during the war when in fact there was literally a fight over whether or not there would be a United States government. But in the years after the Civil War, the question of what America was going to be. I mean, was it in fact going to be a place where every person, including women, as well as African Americans and Mexican Americans and Asian Americans and indigenous people, had a say? Or was it in fact going to be another nation of white supremacy? And then by the 1880s, 1890s, you have the very real concern on the part of middle class and upper class Americans that workers are going to take over and destroy capitalism and thereby destroy American democracy. And on the other side, you have workers taking a look at what seemed to be the extraordinary movement of money upward and taking matters into their own hands until we in fact get a tax on the government, including the assassination of a president. So the idea that we are certainly in a new moment because a member of our administration and members of our administration themselves are physically attacking our Congress, which is, of course, first among equals in our 3 branches of government. But in terms of being concerned about the existence and the survival of democracy, no, we've been here before.
Heather, you said something I don't want to let go. You said you believe that the president instigated the mob attack on the Capitol, but it sounded as though you were talking about more than simply the speech he gave in the hours before the full-on attack. Is there more to what you're saying than that incendiary speech at the White House?
Well, yes, there's the fact that there are significant members in the current Republican Party who have insisted that acknowledged by all parties involved to be a fair election, not a free election necessarily, because there was certainly voter suppression, especially in southern states, of Democrats, not of Republicans, but it certainly was an election that was not marked by irregularities or fraud. And that was tested in the courts repeatedly. It was tested by Republican secretaries of state and electoral officials. It was tested in the Supreme Court. And there was really no doubt about that. And the idea that somehow that this was a fraudulent election was a poison that was injected into our bloodstream. And it was injected into our bloodstream by our elected Republican officials. And again, that is unconscionable. In it, to sow that kind of misunderstanding or lies from their part about our elections is itself a fundamental attack on our democracy. And that is absolutely behind the fear and anger on the part of the people who stormed the Capitol.
I guess I'm probing for something even more specific. We've seen reports in the last day that Michael Flynn's brother in the Pentagon was part of the meeting where they sort of slow walked or declined help for the DC police. We've seen reports over the last week that Trump campaign officials were instrumental in organizing the rally itself on January 6th. And that's where my question was going, was whether you see evidence not just of denial of the election results, which is pretty outrageous in itself, not just a rhetorical call to storm the Capitol, which in this case turned out to be more than rhetorical, but a kind of instrumental organization of the potential decapitating of the line of succession by the president or those around him.
So I've seen the same things you have seen, and a couple of things. I have not seen that high-ranking officials have yet been attached to the formation of the rally. I've seen staffers. Now, would the staffers have been there without the participation of their bosses? Probably not, but I have not seen evidence of that. As for Michael Flynn's brother, I've seen that as well, and it certainly does not look good. But one of the things that I'm always trying to urge people to do in any moment, but certainly in a moment like this, is to wait and to see what we really know, because I suspect many of your listeners have brothers that we would not like to be responsible for, and I know nothing about Michael Flynn's brother. Maybe he is absolutely on the up and up. It was a meeting of several people. Who knows how much influence he had? The only reason that looks funny to me, and again, in America, we do not hold family members responsible for the behavior of each other. The only reason that looks funny to me is that the Army lied about it. Lied about the fact he was there. So it seems to me a probe is absolutely in order, but I am not ready to assume that that Michael Flynn's brother is behind this until we actually have evidence that he has done something himself. So my expectation, and certainly my hope, is that the Biden Department of Justice is going to look into this very thoroughly. I will say it is very interesting that we do not yet have movement forward to go ahead and confirm Biden's choice for Department of Justice, Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland is very well known as being fair and being good, being very good at what he does. When he was appointed to the federal bench, he was confirmed unanimously by Republicans and Democrats. And if you remember, I believe it was Lindsey Graham who said, in terms of filling the Supreme Court seat left by Samuel Alito, he said, well, if only Obama would appoint somebody like Merrick Garland, we'd be fine, but he's going to appoint somebody who's radical. And so Obama appointed Merrick Garland, and he didn't get a hearing. But the head of the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, is crucially important for figuring out how to do this sort of an investigation. And the fact that there does not seem to be any quick movement on the part of the Senate currently to go ahead and fill that very important slot, that's something else I'm watching.
We've got the great Heather Cox Richardson with us. You may be one of the hundreds of thousands who get her daily email, Letters from an American. It has been a crucial guide for so many people over this last year, and it's so great to have her with us. Your questions are welcome on Facebook Live at AshbrookLIVE, and we've got people lining up there, Heather, right now. And so I want to look at the moment we're at, where it falls in the American story. But tell us something first. What is it that you're a historian who writes these days every single day about what's going on in the news. So what is that role? I've been a journalist most of my life, and we always have described journalism as the first draft of history. That's a kind of a commonplace way of describing it. What is it that you do in Letters from America? What do you call that?
Well, you know, I started Letters from an American only because people on my own Facebook page were asking questions about what the heck was happening with the Ukraine scandal. And because I know the mechanics of politics really well, having done it as long as I have, I could say, oh, well, this is what this role is, and this is who this person is. And then quickly it became clear that I was doing what I considered a diary very similar to a Civil War diary, for example, by Mary Chestnut or by George Strong, or one of the people who observed the world, not simply by saying, you know, I got up today and had tea, although believe me, Mary Chestnut has a lot of tea, but who gets up and says, this is what's happening in the world. And always I have in the back of my head, what does a historian in 100 years need to know here? So one of the things I'm toying with these days is what the heck to do with the Bernie memes? I mean, I sort of feel like I need to leave a marker for a historian someday to go, here's why he's funny. Here's
Bernie in the mittens.
Bernie in the mittens. As somebody said, the Democrats are now in charge, mittens off. So that took over, but I have come to think, you know, I keep saying to people, it's not me. It's a reflection of the world around me. So it's my readers read it as much as I do. And, you know, I've come to think that maybe it has a lot to do with being a teacher for so many years. You know, people talk about how wonderful teachers are and you have to bring so much to the classroom, but you also, if it's done right, a classroom is a collaborative venture. And I feel like a lot of what I do is sort of saying, hey, here's a problem. How are we going to think about this? And I listen to what people say and I say, oh, that's what you need to understand in order to move down that road. You have to understand the filibuster. You have to understand what's happening in an impeachment trial. And so maybe a lot of it is just simply carrying a classroom into a national forum.
It may be collaborative, but you've got to be up most of the night, almost every night, doing it.
The last 2 nights I've been in bed before midnight.
Hey, it's a new day. It's a new day dawning for Heather. That's amazing. Are we still in crisis at this moment? This was for people who welcomed it, this was an amazingly feel-good week of relief and the kind of demonstration of democratic traditions and customs that we feared had been despoiled for who knows how deeply and for how long. And there they were. There was Joe Biden. There was the whole panorama, not all of it. The departing president wasn't there on the podium, for starters, but a whole lot of it was there. It had a feeling of normalcy. People celebrating the idea of normalcy. But as you look at this with a long lens, are we out of the crisis yet, or are we still very much in it?
Oh, we're very much in it, to my mind, very much in it. I mean, the immediate crisis was over. And I think that it's important to remember that for all that things feel tense now, and why people like me are finally sleeping, and I'm not the only one to say this right now, is that if Trump had been reelected, and mind you, you asked me about the crisis of January 6th, the bigger crisis to my mind was the fact that he worked very, very hard to steal that election. And I think he really expected to have done so. And that's one of the reasons he refused to give it up. And if he had in fact been reelected, I shudder to think of what this country would look like. Now that what he could do, even without power or with waning power, has been stripped clear, I literally, that keeps me up. That used to keep me up at night. That moment is over. But what we are facing right now is a crisis on multiple fronts. There is, of course, the coronavirus. I don't need to belabor that. There's also an extraordinary economic crisis that looks a lot like the 1850s or the 1890s or the 1920s, and that's that we've gone through a period, a generation or more, where our legislation has moved money to the very top of the economic scale. And what that means is that for 90% of Americans, their lives have not gotten better in 2 generations. They've at best stayed the same, and for many people, they've actually moved down significantly. And that's had all kinds of educational and cultural and social repercussions, as well as the economic ones. So there's that crisis. But over all of that is one of those more than generation, one of those epic crises that America has faced periodically over one thing or another. In the 1850s and 1840s and 1850s, we lived through the crisis of westward expansion. In the 1880s and through the 1900s, we lived through the crisis of industrialization. In the post-World War II period, we lived through the crisis of a new nuclear world. Now we're living through a crisis of the fact that the mechanics of our democracy no longer is representational. So we have, for example, one of the statistics I pulled last night, the fact that the 50 senators who represent Republicans represent 41.5 fewer Americans than the
41.5 million, 41.5 million fewer.
Million, which I believe is bigger than the population of Canada. I might be wrong about that. Than the Republicans do. That's a problem. All right. You know, however you want to solve that, that's a problem.
So right on that mechanic, you're saying there they are with half the votes in the Senate, and yet they represent 41+ million fewer Americans.
That's correct.
That's a mechanical problem.
Well, and then you've got the problem of the filibuster in the Senate, which I wrote about last night. The filibuster has a long history, and it basically kind of got hung around in the way that it didn't in the House because it's, you know, they just never had to get rid of it. And what that means is that one senator from one of those states can stop any legislation he or she wants. And that doesn't work, you know. Then there's the Electoral College, which again was bastardized in 1800 by Thomas Jefferson, one of the reasons I hate Thomas Jefferson. And we got the winner-take-all system. And then we got the fact that the Electoral College does not actually represent the states fully any longer because we capped the number of people who could be in the House of Representatives in 1929, which means that bigger states are far less represented than smaller states simply because of the way the formula works. Those are things that were solutions at the time for one problem or another. In 29, it was the realization that urban states were going to outweigh rural states. But it's simply not viable. Either we have to say we're not going to be a democracy anymore, or we're going to have to fix the mechanics. And that's a crisis that is not going to go away if the Republicans take power again or the Democrats take power again. We need to make our skin fit our body, if you will. It's time to molt and start again. And that's going to be really hard because we have to think of new ways to handle our democracy. And then, of course, we have the crisis that speaks to that, and that's the crisis of the fact we have unregulated psychological operations, basically, in our current media landscape. And there are solutions to all these things, but it's going to be a lot of work to find them.
How do you fix them when one of the two major parties, and we're a two-party system, has, speaking of skin, they have skin in the game for minority control because they've wrapped themselves around a kind of white identity in no small part. And demographically, white Americans, traditionally defined, are a shrinking portion of the population. So they've kind of married the party to these faulty mechanics. They're relying on the faulty mechanics. Gerrymandering, the filibuster, voter suppression, the Electoral College. This has become the core toolkit in many ways of the Republican Party. How do you fix it when half the senators, for just to name one branch, are wrapped around it?
Well, you know, the only solution that I can come up with is to go to the people. I mean, if you look at any poll, most Americans agree, even on our hot button issues. And when I say most agree, I don't mean by like 50.2%. I mean, more than 70% of Americans believe in common sense gun control. More than 70% believe that abortion should be safe and legal and rare. You know, our numbers are really quite large there, but they're being torn apart by especially Republican politicians. And the only precedent that I can see for going ahead and helping to move around that political logjam is Theodore Roosevelt, who of course faced the exact same thing when he became president in 1901. And you know, there's this wonderful moment where he's about to give his first message to Congress, and in typical Teddy Roosevelt fashion, like normally a message to Congress is written and given to the clerk of the House of Representatives, and the clerk is supposed to read it, but he almost never does in the 19th century. Teddy Roosevelt has his printed up and put in tooled leather. Like, it's just so Teddy Roosevelt.
Handed down on Mount Sinai.
Totally. And he's this young guy who's, you know, he just thinks, well, he's Teddy Roosevelt, right? They ran out of the letter I when they had to go ahead and print his speeches. But he gives it, and all the old guard, which is absolutely in the pocket of big business, they literally are describing themselves as, I'm the senator for the Jute Trust, I'm the senator for the Sugar Trust, and they're waiting for this to come down. They're like, we're in such trouble, he's going to do, and he gives a speech, and he writes a speech, and he basically says, or he writes this message, and he basically says, you guys need to tell us what you're doing. And then if there's a problem, we're going to write a law about it. And they're like, he wants transparency. We're not going to do that. And they have all these messages to each other being like, we thought he was going to be a problem, but he's not. He's a total weenie. We're good here. Teddy Roosevelt goes around them and he goes to the people. And from his insistence, if you actually look at Roosevelt's record, he does not accomplish very much legislatively. He gets a few things through, like the Food and Drug Act in 1905, but that's after everybody's read The Jungle and the sausages made of human beings and all that. So he gets that, but he gets very little done legislatively. What he does get done is he changes the direction of the ship of state. And it's really his successors, people like Taft and then Woodrow Wilson, who go ahead and manage to get into place legislation that goes ahead and trims back the power of big business in that era. So we do have a model for what you do when the government has been locked into the hands of people who are determined to be anti-democratic.
But what would that mean? Do you mean Joe Biden should just be rhetorically super persuasive for the next 4 years and get the American people looking in a different direction? Who's going to buy that if we don't get actual real change along with it?
Well, remember, Teddy Roosevelt talked a lot to media, for sure. He called the presidency his bully pulpit, by which he meant not, I'm bullying you, but bully was a word at the time for, this is great. So it was his bully pulpit. But what did he do? He talked to the journalists. And I don't know, Tom, maybe journalists could, I don't know, do Facebook things where they talk to people about what democracy's like or something? Maybe an idea?
Maybe the filibuster stands right in front of whatever Biden may want to do. There's a lot of talk now about Democrats bulldozing it, but one way or another, either directly through getting all the senators on board, good luck with Joe Manchin, but we'll see, or indirectly, there are other ways that they could sort of pull the plug on the filibuster. One of the fears in that has been, if they should again lose the Senate, the filibuster would also not be there for them to put a brake on Republicans. Do you favor letting the filibuster go, throwing it in the dustbin of history?
Yeah, I do. I think I do. It's funny you say that, because I am, for all that I'm such a, let's go into the future, I tend to be very conservative about our government. It took me many years to talk me around to getting rid of the Electoral College, and still I'm like, well, let's just put it back the way it was. Mm-hmm. But I don't. The thing about, I guess, if I had my druthers, what I would do is I would take the filibuster back to what it used to be, which is that if you really want to filibuster something, you have to stand up all night and talk. And that you can look, I was looking at a chart just today, as one does, about how frequently the cloture has been used to stop a filibuster. And, starting in about, really starting a little bit, starting with Barack Obama, the numbers go off the charts. I mean, it like bumps along like this throughout our history, and then it just goes through the roof. And it's like, that's not okay. We used to be able to get stuff done. Many young people don't know that, but the Senate actually used to do things. It used to have debates and it used to vote on things. We need that again. We cannot have a system where it takes 60 senators to even bring something to a vote. I mean, that's insane. So I think either we go back to what it used to be, where people filibustered only if it was something they felt incredibly strongly about, which tended to happen only from, at the time, Democrats who were opposed to civil rights legislation, or we get rid of it altogether, because it's simply not tenable to say that we are going from a majority-based system to a two-thirds based system. It's just not.
In that case, if they get rid of it, you'd have 50-50 and Vice President Kamala Harris to break the tie. That would give Joe Biden a pretty free hand to move major legislation. Can we do it without that? I mean, is there another way to fix the mechanics of democracy other than getting legislation in gear that would actually let it happen?
Well, I wish there were. I mean, certainly it was only under Mitch McConnell that they really started this process of refusing to bring anything to a vote unless there were 60 votes. And similarly in the House of Representatives, I think it was John Boehner, the Republican Speaker of the House, who started to use what he called the Hastert Rule, which was never actually a rule. And that was the idea that he wouldn't bring anything to the floor of the House unless it could pass solely on Republican votes. I mean, the whole point used to be that you wanted to nail together some kind of a coalition of one sort or another between two parties. But this was definitely a Republican tactic. And, I would love to say that we could go back to that, but I think we've seen just in the last day and a half that Mitch McConnell has no intention at all of operating in good faith. He is operating for the continuation of the power of the Republicans to continue to push their ideological position, which has been the one that's gotten us back into this corner. So, you know, I'd love to say we could go back to a world in which people actually cooperated across the aisle, but as you know, I've talked about a lot, the Republican Party got taken over by a radical extremist cabal. They are not traditional Republicans. So maybe the answer is you change the rules to get rid of this group of people, and then you bring them back when you can agree to do so. I will say, before you say that with 50 votes, Biden should be able to get away with things, you know, you've got Kirsten Sinema in Arizona. You've got Joe Manchin in West Virginia. You know, one of the things that Biden's going to face and that the Congress is going to face is there's a huge backlog of stuff that simply needs doing. So it may look as if Biden's getting a lot of stuff done, but you know, some of the things that the Republicans are now screaming is radical are not radical, to my mind anyway. For example, the tax proposal, which is solely to get us back to where we were before Trump blew an absolute hole through our debt and our deficit by passing the tax cuts that moved extraordinary amounts of money upward. Biden's talking about going back to before that happened. That is not some radical leftist program. It is just the opposite. It's sort of trying to get us a little bit closer to being in the middle of the road.
How do we get out of this? We're in crisis, you say. It would be great to feel as if we were in some other kind of state, a state of getting things fixed up and moving forward into our actual future. That has been made foggy and sort of blindingly confusing by all the channels of disinformation we have in our society right now. What do we do about that? You talked about that as one of our crises. There's a rumor on the internet today, on the social media, that Australia is banning Fox News. I guess that's not true. But what do we do with major purveyors of disinformation that millions of Americans have now been, you have to say it, led astray by for, well, it's now decades. What do we do about that?
Well, Fox News, to my mind, is the easy one. So one of the things I think to which you're pointing is that we used to have the Fairness Doctrine that was disbanded by the Federal Communications Commission in 1987 under Ronald Reagan, and that's what opened up the door for disinformation, largely, especially on radio, talk radio. That's when Rush Limbaugh got his start, and shortly after that, you were going to have Alex Jones, for example. But the problem with trying to reinstate the Fairness Doctrine
and just to be clear, because I think people have forgotten you could ever have things differently, but when the Fairness Doctrine was still in effect, if somebody came on the radio, local radio station, with a very incendiary position, a kind of an on-air op-ed or whatever it was, they were required to keep their license, to bring on someone of an opposing view and give them basically equal airtime. My
example is always Rosanna Dana on Saturday Night Live. Remember her? You know?
Yes.
She'd come in when they came out against euthanasia. She would come on and go like, I think children growing up in China are a good thing, you know? Well, and they also had to be fact-based. I mean, the idea was you actually had to have facts. You couldn't just say whatever you wanted, which good journalists do. And one of the other things I like to emphasize is, you know, there are conservative journalists who are good journalists. They might not have a spin that people more on the left like, but their stuff is fact-based. So a great example of that is Chris Wallace on the Fox News channel, or Shep Smith, who left Fox News and went to CNBC. I don't know where he went. CNBC, is that right? And I'm sure there are others on the Fox News channel I'm not thinking of right now. But a journalist checks their sources. They have to have at least two sources to say something, and they're fact checked.
But as Shep Smith just said in the last couple of days, that it is, and this is pretty obvious, but he said that false and misleading news sources, in effect, are injurious to society. Well, we're seeing that, but what do you do about it? There it sits, and there's the First Amendment.
Well, so as I say, the Fox News channel, to my mind, is easy because it's my understanding that the majority of the money that goes into the Fox News channel is not from advertisers. So you look, for example, at boycotts of, say, the performer Sean Hannity, who's not a journalist, and that's been in front of the courts repeatedly, and him saying, I'm only an entertainer, so you can't hold me responsible. if you look, he doesn't actually have a lot of advertising on his show.
My Pillow. You wonder, how can he get by with only My Pillow ads?
Because the Fox News Channel model has always been that its money comes from being bundled with other cable channels. And it's bundled with those other cable channels, and it makes quite a bit of money. I believe, I am not a tech person, but I believe only ESPN and one other actually get more for each cable package. Their numbers are really quite high. I was looking it up last night. I want to say it's between $1.50 and $2 to be bundled with the things everybody else wants. So
every
like
month from every subscriber to a cable package.
Even if you never turn it on.
Even if you hate it.
Even if you hate it. So one of the things that last night a lawyer, a former JAG lawyer, suggested was, that's a regulation change. You simply say that you have to that you can unbundle things you don't want. I mean, it's crazy that we as consumers have to pay for things we hate. That's stupid. But that's another great example of a place where you would want regular, ordinary Americans to say, hey, I don't want to be tossing $2 a month into the pot for Fox News. I'm going to drop you as a provider if you do that, or that we need to have some sort of regulation. So that to me is, no, I'm sorry, regulation in terms of the cable bundling. That to me is easier than taking on the stuff that's on the internet.
So you'd have Joe Biden through change in regulation, through that, whatever that process might be, basically remove a huge chunk of Fox News revenue.
Well, again, I am not a tech person and I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me that it does not make sense that we as consumers are forced to pay for things that we don't want and things that are actively destroying our democracy. So you couldn't go after the Fox News channel because it's on cable. It doesn't have a license, which is how the Fairness Doctrine worked. You couldn't go after it with something like that you couldn't go after it with something like the Fairness Doctrine because it's not licensed. It's a private company, and the government could not do that. But what it could do is say, we're going to make a requirement that you have to unbundle your shows so that consumers don't have to buy things they don't want to, and force Fox News to compete in a free and fair market the way everything else has to. And that, I think, would be a really effective way to force Fox News to clean up its act. I do not think it would be able to stay effective the way it is now if it had to actually compete for viewers rather than being basically paid because they're good lobbyists. So that, and again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a tech person, I'm not a tech thinker, not a tech scholar, but to me that seems like there must be an obvious way that most consumers would really like, because they would just as soon not pay for the Fox News channel, or I don't know, and I'm making up a channel here because I don't watch a lot of TV, the flower arranging channel, maybe, somebody doesn't want to pay for that. That, it seems to be a la carte, seems to me like something whose day might have come. I don't know, just a guess.
All of social media is really under scrutiny now. Facebook, Twitter, and all the rest, Facebook in particular, is seen as a kind of generator of polarization by design, by algorithm. And between some of these twisted, quote unquote, news networks and social media that prizes conflict and gives a platform to all kinds of craziness, we have a country where a lot of people really aren't necessarily aware of facts, or they may know about them, but they're empowered in embracing illusion because it's fed to them again and again as if it were fact. You look back at the 19th century, there were plenty of newspapers, but I don't know what access was like. What's your sense of how reality-based Americans were in the 19th century when they were, I don't know, out in the woods somewhere, out on the windswept prairie, compared to now? Did they know what was going on better in their country than people do today? Were they more grounded in a realistic sense of the nation than Americans in the year 2021, or not?
I love this question because, in fact, American journalism has gone through periods in which it gets extraordinarily polarized. And I could tell you about the financing of old journals, but I'll probably save you from that. It gets extraordinarily polarized. And when that happens, we tend to move to the middle. We actually get the Fairness Doctrine in part because of the extraordinary polarization of the late 1890s. and the idea that we have to actually have fact-based journalism. And when it seems like the journals are not, I'm sorry, I call them journals because my head's in the 19th century. When it seems like newspapers are not representing everybody, we get new newspapers. So many of them don't exist now, but the part of the country that you and I came from originally, you know, the populists in the 1880s and the 1890s created their entire new system of journals, newspapers, many of which no longer exist, but that informed farmers about what was actually happening in the financial markets and happening to crops and happening with the railroads back east, and how the government was being perverted by the very wealthy back east. So the problems that we're facing are nothing new. And I've thought a bit about the internet often as sort of an intellectual Wild West, where initially anything went, and now that people are starting to crack down and say you're destroying our society, the people who are originally there and shooting up the saloons are furious, but those of us who would like to live here peacefully are like, you know, you gotta dial things back. And you can see that, as I say, happening, as you just said, I'm sorry, happening with all the places now that are cracking down on QAnon and so on. But so that's the journalist side of it. But here's the other piece: the crazy extremism in journals and newspapers and media always happens when money moves to the top of the economy, because people who are losing out, either usually financially, but also socially or culturally or religiously, they're losing out and they need someone to blame. And they're very easy to be turned against one group or another. And one of the things that I'm hoping this new administration is going to focus on, because of Biden's past, because of who he is putting into office, because of Vice President Kamala Harris, is the trying to even out our laws so that ordinary Americans actually can make their lives better by working hard and getting an education. And I think once you start to have an economy that serves everybody again, instead of a very small percentage, that polarization is going to stop, because people are much more likely to say, yeah, it's okay with me if so-and-so, you know, gets a college scholarship, because my kids are going to be going to college too. It's okay with me if we put more money into the SNAP program because, you know, my kids have enough to eat. And if you look at the times in America when we have worked together and when there has been reform, they are always times of economic prosperity.
What did it
for
take,
everybody, not just for a few people.
What did it take to, David Brooks, running today in the New York Times, is talking about the redistribution of dignity. This is more than money, but let's be real, it's also about money. As you say, people feel more stature and representation in society when they're not on the outside looking in all the time. What has it taken to pull the plug on those great concentrations of wealth? Was trust busting enough? How did we do it in the past? It seems so daunting now. And not only because you have so many in Congress, and not only Republicans who have been very supportive of big money and very supported by big money, but I feel a kind of, maybe it will change now, but a kind of nonchalance, even amongst well-to-do Democrats, about the fundamentals that have supported their affluent lifestyle. People get used to being on top and, you know, up high on the hog, as we used to say. How do you pull the plug on that?
Well, again, I think it comes down to involving everybody in our country, in our democracy. And by everybody, I don't mean every last, you know, person in existence, because lots of people are apolitical and don't want to be involved. But again, if you think about the progressive era, what got that moving was, what got it articulated was Teddy Roosevelt, and that articulator is very important. But what got it moving was ordinary Americans. And the same is true of the Depression, World War II, and what happened in the 1950s. Those are ordinary Americans. And one of the things that I think it's important to remember is the perceived disdain of elites for ordinary Americans was constructed. That was something that Pat Buchanan put in place in the Nixon administration to go ahead and create this divide. These elites are looking down on you. And you hear that again and again. If you listen to right-wing channels, you hear those elites hate you. But what's interesting is, you know, I walk on both sides of this divide. And there was a piece in the National Review yesterday, I think, I've kind of lost track of the days, by Kevin Williamson, which was just absolutely disdainful of Trump voters. I mean, using words against my neighbors that not only would I not say, I would not think. And so somehow this idea that it's the Republicans who are on the side of the little guy, I mean, they've never been. If you really, I mean, that's not Kevin Williamson's first piece like that, let me tell you. There was a major one, I think, well, whatever. He talks like that a lot. So this idea that somehow the the Republicans are the ones speaking for the little guy, first of all, is wrong. But second of all, I think there's a big groundswell now of individuals who are getting involved in the country in ways they weren't, and taking back not only their voice, but also part of taking back your voice is taking back your dignity. And one of the places I see this that a lot of people don't, and maybe you and I have even talked about this before, is a lot of women organize on social media platforms, and it's just flying below the radar screen. I've been trying for 4 years to get people to report on this, and a lot of people are just not seeing it. And I keep saying,
well, about women being what you said, women being
women
being
organizing on social media.
Oh yeah, my gosh, yeah, we've seen. I mean, look at Georgia, huge effect right there for one.
Exactly. So, that's part of that is empowerment, the same way that the populist movement was, which later led into the progressive movement. So how do you do this? You just start listening to people and giving them a platform to have a voice, the way that Facebook, for example, does.
You think it can happen despite the mechanical defects in our democracy right now, that this voice of the people can come back, take charge, demand change in such a way through our mechanisms that it actually appears?
Yes, I do. I think that's the only way you make change. Again, if every single American today called their cable provider and said, unbundle Fox News or I'm dropping you, imagine what would happen. But I feel like this is the interview of me going, well, let's game that out, because let's game it out if we don't fix our democracy. Like, what does that look like?
I think it looks like January 6th.
That's right. That's right. It looks like January 6th, or it looks like fascism. Although, I keep saying this, technically, I don't believe that the previous administration was a fascist administration. It was an oligarchic one. To you and me, that doesn't make any difference. But in terms of who supports it, it doesn't make any difference, because they're coming for you, for people like us anyway. But in either case. But either we're looking at a full, an oligarchy like Putin's Russia, or what's happening in Turkey, or we make our skin fit our muscle and we retake democracy. But I don't really see a middle ground there. I mean, we're at the rubber meeting the road stage, and one side or the other is going to win.
Kim writes to us, I'm one of those women organizers, and I'm so on the unbundling idea. So there's one phone line that may be lighting up this afternoon. James is writing about these measures to deal with inequality being portrayed again and again for a long time in American history as socialism. Do you think Americans have gotten over that phobia? Does that buzzword still scare people away from policies that bring equity, the kind of policies we had when Dwight Eisenhower was president?
And the upper tax bracket was 91%. So the answer is, I think, no. I think that the word socialism is still a huge buzzword on the right. And one of the things that I do at least once a week is try and put out in public where we got our fear of socialism. And it does not come from 20th century international socialism. It comes from 1871, in the wake of the Civil War, when African Americans begin to vote. Democrats, white Democrats in the South and in the North, but especially in the South, who object to Black rights, make the argument that letting African Americans vote, which is brand new in 1871 after the 15th Amendment in 1870, means that they will vote for politicians who will give them stuff. And at that point, they're not really worried about Black politicians so much as white politicians doing things for African Americans. So the idea is that if Black people vote, they're going to vote for politicians who are going to do things like build roads and make schools and build hospitals. And that's going to cost tax dollars. And in the South, after the Civil War, basically the only people who had any property were white, because Black people couldn't have property before that. And so they make the argument quite articulately, beginning in 1861 with Andrew Johnson, but then later on by 1871, lots of people are making it. that letting Black people vote is, because of that equation, that they're going to get these programs that are going to be paid for by tax dollars, is a redistribution of wealth from white people to Black people. And by 1871, opponents of the idea of Black rights are calling this socialism. They are literally writing articles that say things like socialism in South Carolina.
And was socialism already a scary word? I mean, by the 20th century, we'd seen, revolution in the Soviet Union, and we saw the roots of it coming up in China and all the rest. Was socialism that frightening in 1871?
They make it frightening. Socialism doesn't have a lot of meaning in that period. It's been the sort of thing that's been attached to utopian communities before the Civil War. But it starts to be frightening in 1871. The reason I keep pinning it on that, because of the Paris Commune, which holds control over Paris from March through May of that year, and workers take control of the government. So this is very much tied into the idea, the newly emerging ideas of Marxism, and the idea that workers will take over the government and redistribute wealth. And so they tie those two things together. But when we talk about socialism in America, actual socialism, the idea of workers owning the means of production through the government or not, but that idea has never been popular in America. The best it ever did for electing a president was in 1912, when Eugene Debs got 900,000 votes, about 6% of the vote. That's the best they ever did. This is not something that is sweeping the country. So I always try and make that distinction, because then if people understand, we're really not talking about being Venezuela, which I hear again and again and again. We're simply talking about taking off the hard edges of capitalism. A lot of people are like, well, yeah, I'm in favor of that, but just not socialism. They're really entirely different things, and it's a shame that they have the same word.
Joe Biden used the phrase white supremacy in the inaugural address, his inaugural address. He also used the word uncivil, which I read maybe from you hadn't been used since one of Abraham Lincoln's speeches way back when. Think with us about the shrinking white majority, rapidly shrinking now in this country, and how it accepts or doesn't accept the demographic reality of America's future. And we can't really go forward successfully if we don't embrace the reality of what we are and what we are becoming. You've tracked a lot, and you've tracked a lot around the Civil War where this was acute. Do you think white America is capable? Looks to me like the Constitution is all ready to support this multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial future, and even let the country thrive. But will white America swallow the pill, or rather go down in flames? We saw some who would.
So I'm going to go ahead and be a historian here. So that you hear a lot, the whole that we're a majority minority country, or minority whatever. That white people won't put up with, the immigrants and all that. And it always, and I don't mean to denigrate the strife we're in now. I love the fact that people say that, and they look again back at the Civil War. At the time of the Civil War, Irish immigrants were not considered white. And certainly when Mike Pompeo said that the other day, I'm like, your last name is Pompeo. The immigrants, the Italian immigrants in the 1880s and the 1890s into the 1900s were literally not considered white. So what is white anyway? When people say that, I always think of a student I had when I was teaching at MIT, and she was Chinese. She was not Chinese anymore. She'd become an American less than a year before. She spoke incredibly poor English. Her family had come over, and she was now a citizen, and I was teaching the Civil War. And she got so excited about it and how important the Union was. And she in terribly broken English said, "This is why we fought that war. This is what we stood for." And I thought, we's working really hard here. But the idea is that America has never, ever been about the color of your skin. It has been about what you believe. And so can we, can white Americans approach this moment? Well, they sure as hell better be able to, because that's what we've always stood for. And these reactionary moments where we're like, no, we're going to be a little party over here by ourselves are, what are you doing? You're cutting yourself off from the rest of the world. So Can it happen? Yeah, sure it can happen if we do like Mike Pompeo suggested and just get rid of the majority of the country. And what does that leave us with? Absolutely nothing. So once again, I don't think it's like a fight. I mean, I think we just got to the people who don't like it got to deal with reality here.
Well, of course it can happen. I think it will happen, but we've just witnessed. You can define white any way you like, and of course you can say race is just fictional construction. I get all of that, but if it motivates a group of people to action, you can have January 6th. You can have one of the two parties wrapped around an identity, whatever you think its basis in reality is or isn't. You know, it still feels in political terms like a hump that people need to get over, and I'm praying we get over it soon so that there's not more damage done. But it sure has been wielded in a potent way. What about a potential splitting of the Republican Party, Heather? Do you see it coming? Do you see it as a possibility?
Yes, and I don't mean to denigrate. I'm sorry, typically just poured something all over my lap here. I don't mean to denigrate the moment we're in and the dangers for people of color and for women. I mean, one of the things that it's important to remember, people say, well, this has so far been bloodless. I'm like, no, it hasn't. It hasn't been bloodless at all. I mean, in addition to the extraordinary deaths of people of color in the last several years, domestic violence is off the charts. Women are dying in huge numbers too. More than half of our mass shootings are domestic violence, killing, I'm sorry, not a shooting of more than 4 people. And most in America are domestic violence. So I'm not trying to make light of the dangers we're in at all, but simply to say that, you know, when I hear we're going to be a majority minority country, I'm like, you know, they said the exact same thing in the 1850s. So, you know, we'll just expand our intellectual boundaries, and as we should. And that's obviously a much longer conversation, but splitting the Republican Party, absolutely, absolutely. And what's really interesting about that, I made that distinction between the fascists and the oligarchs because I'm playing with these ideas. The reason that matters for the Republican Party is that in order to have a viable political party, you need to have money behind it. I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, but it costs money to run a political party. You need to have mailing lists, you need to have offices, you need to have salaried people. I mean, it's a business. As well as being a political organization, it's a business, and you need money.
Clearly.
And the problem with what Trump did to the Republican Party is that it was not based in an even-handed system. It was based in basically an oligarchy, the way, for example, Putin's Russia is, so that you have to be on the inside with the head guy. And the problem with that is Trump was so mercurial that if you're somebody who's running a corporation and you know he can get pissed off at you over dinner and tank your stock by tweeting the next day, you are much less likely to want to support him than if there is sort of a blanket, the government is going to work with business the way it does in a fascist system. So the fact that he was trying to organize things around him as an oligarchical system mattered deeply for the Republican Party, and the split that is happening right now. So you can see it happening between I'm going to call them establishment Republicans, although I always like to keep the distinction that these are not traditional Republicans. They're a branch called movement conservatism that took over the party in the 1990s. But those establishment Republicans who want the laws to be beneficial to the wealthy and to corporations for ideological reasons, but they want laws, as opposed to the ones who simply want a strong man in the form of Donald Trump, because they know that a legal system that is even-handed will not keep themselves in power. And that split seems to me to be irrevocable at this point.
Does that mean a new party emerging? We hear a lot of talk about it. People at the Lincoln Project and elsewhere, it feels as though they're prepping for a new party, for a break in the Republican Party and a new party to emerge. What does history tell us about the potential for success? We've always been, by and large, this big two-party behemoth.
Well, you know, I'm a prophet of the past and not the future. For years, everybody has been predicting the death of the Republican Party. And my take on it is a little bit different in that the Republican Party is ideologically part of our DNA, which I could talk about, but it's also structurally part of our system at this point. And if I had to guess, I would guess that the Republican Party, the establishment, the people I just called establishment, although they are not traditional Republicans, they're going to take the race car, if you will, and steer it back closer to the middle than it has been under Trump. And the split will come with the Trumpers going off and forming their own coalition. But you can already see that the Proud Boys have turned against Trump already. They're going to probably go back to the splits that there's always been in the far right movement in America. And by the way, we have always had a far right movement in America. This is nothing new. So my guess is the Republican Party is going to steer itself out of the ditch back into the mainstream and keep the same name and probably moderate some of its ideological positions. So that's my guess. But maybe it'll flip the other way. But no, I don't see one new party. I think if we get ranked choice voting, we'll get more than one new party. But that's a hard thing to pull off without ranked choice voting.
What does history tell us, and maybe Civil War history in particular, about the urge to punish those who were part of the effort to derail the election results, starting with the president, going into the Senate? You've got Ted Cruz and you've got Hawley and others. You've got many in the House, 40 or 50 or more. No, a lot more, 140. What should happen? People talk about expulsion. People talk about criminal charges against some. Right now, we've got impeachment coming next week. What does history tell us about the right way to handle those who endanger democracy itself?
History says people must be held accountable to the law. And that's a complicated idea. So, I wouldn't use the word punish there necessarily, because if in fact you went ahead and indicted and held trials for all the people at the Capitol, some people would be found not guilty, as our system should provide for if they have not committed, and obviously if you're inside the building, you committed a crime. But I'm making a point here that the problem with not holding people accountable for crimes is that even under the guise of unity or magnanimity or of, use your word, whatever word you want there, the problem with that is that it means that the next set of people do worse. So repeatedly in our history, but certainly one of the great examples is after the Confederacy, there was no punishment for having tried to destroy the American government. There was literally no punishment. It was like, oopsie poopsie, why don't you go home and just don't do it again? Mm-hmm. And what did that do? That meant that former Confederates felt empowered to go home and kill Union allies, the African Americans who fought on the side of the Union. They felt empowered to go ahead and take back their seats in Congress in the 1860s and then the 1870s, when in fact in 1879, they tried to destroy the United States government from within. And then of course, we've had increasingly this turn back to the principles of the Confederacy. Comparably, the Chinese Taiping Rebellion, they did not set up, handshakes over that. The empire went ahead and executed the leaders of the Taiping and many of the foot soldiers of the Taiping, and you do not see that still being issued, to my knowledge anyway, in Chinese society. In a more modern era, of course, we let Richard Nixon get away with trying to attack the Democrats in the 1972 election. And even though he had been impeached by the House Judiciary Committee and would have been impeached by the House and then convicted by the Senate, he was pardoned. And what we got from that was a whole bunch of Nixon supporters, including, by the way, Paul Manafort and Roger Stone, and Lee Atwater, who died but went ahead and took some of the principles forward into later Republican administrations. Simply deciding that the only problem had been that they hadn't fought hard enough, and so they could really go scorched earth going in the future. So there are two ways to approach a moment like this. One is to say, we're not going to do anything and we're all just going to shake hands and it's going to be great. And that's a disaster. Or you can do what East Germany did after World War II and say, we don't care if you were even Nazi adjacent, we're going to execute you. And that didn't help because it destroyed the rule of law. West Germany went ahead and adhered to the rule of law. And some people went to jail and a lot of people got off for being Nazis or Nazi adjacent. But what that meant was they reinforced the concept of the rule of law and democracy. And that seems to me to be absolutely imperative going forward. This idea that it's an act of unity to say, oh, never mind, is absolutely dead wrong. You don't have to be vindictive, but we do have to have responsibility for our actions in democracy, whether you're, you know, a guy on the street or the president of the United States. You must bear the consequences of your actions.
So who's vulnerable under the law? I know you're not a lawyer, but is the president under the law? Is Ted Cruz under the law? Josh Hawley under the law? Is it against the law to, I mean, they would say, well, we had objections to these Pennsylvania results or these Arizona results. We wanted to voice them. We wanted to vote them. That's legal.
Well, I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to answer that. Maybe that's a defense. I mean, it was pretty clear that those concerns had been utterly debunked. I will point out that the people you're talking about, both in the House and the Senate, could be expelled from the House and the Senate, and so that's another thing that could happen to them. They could be expelled, they could be censured, or they could be reprimanded. And which is censure and reprimand are very similar, except curiously you have to stand in different places if you're censored versus if you're reprimanded, which seems to me to be really kindergarten, but whatever. So I can't answer what those things are. I would be perfectly fine with it if the Department of Justice looks at something that Josh Hawley does and says, no, that was okay, because that's a decision being made by our Department of Justice. What I'm not okay with is people saying, oh, you got to look the other way from what we did. The problem is not what we did. The problem is how you're reacting, which is where we are right now. And that's absolutely a rhetorical construction that is designed to enforce dominance, not to reestablish an even relationship, and as such it is really a bad idea right now. You think I feel strongly about this, Tom?
I think you do. And I think there does need to be accountability. Joe Biden, we've just got you for a few more minutes. Joe Biden standing at the podium with his inaugural speech this week. What was going through your mind as he hit home so hard on the theme of unity, American unity?
Well, you know, it's funny, that's not the theme I heard. I heard unity, of course, which he has beaten until that pony's not breathing very well any longer. What I heard reminded me overwhelmingly of JFK, which surprised me because I don't think a lot about JFK's ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. What I think about when I hear that speech is the fact that that's what prompted James Meredith to go ahead and try and be enrolled at the University of Mississippi, because he's like, wait a minute here.
Young black men, here I go.
Well, but he was also pissed off because JFK was being all highfalutin and didn't happen to mention race. You know, he's like, okay, you want me to go ahead and do something for my country? Watch
Try this on. Yeah.
But what not surprised me, but what I thought really caught the moment in a way that did surprise me, actually, was Biden saying, you know, this is a people's movement. And in our past, when we've had trouble, enough of us have stepped up to the plate to carry all of us. Mm-hmm. And I thought that really caught this brush fire that's going through ordinary Americans right now to say, hey, we care, we're on board, tell us what to do. And so I heard it as a call to service, which I frankly did not expect. When was the last time we heard a call to service? I mean,
well, it wasn't that long. Barack Obama, you know, said this is about us. This isn't over. We've won the election. We're going to keep rolling, and then it didn't really amount to the sea change that he sought.
Well, I heard, and again, I didn't reread his speeches, but I heard Obama more as we are doing it. You know, by virtue of this moment, this country is already on the path. And maybe from George H.W. Bush, you heard 1,000 points of light, because of course he was trying to get people to volunteer. But from Biden, I heard much more, and maybe that's because that's where I am right now. You know, you hear what you're ready to hear. I heard, I can't do this on my own. I mean, this is the moment when American democracy has prevailed today. But what are we going to go doing forward? And that today was also really interesting, because I read that, maybe inadvertently, as a direct response to the QAnon people who were waiting at that moment for Donald Trump to come back and re-seize the presidency and put all the Democrats in jail. And Biden saying, no, this is democracy. It's not your fantasy. This is democracy. So I thought he captured the moment in a way that really surprised me. I thought it was really a home run of a speech, which You know, I'm always leery about those sorts of major speeches because there's too much pressure riding on them. I'm always assuming somebody's going to fall over their feet, although they rarely do. So I thought he really met the moment. And I know I sound surprised, but frankly, I was a little surprised. I was not preparing for much. I expected to hear unity, unity, unity. Let's go do this. And instead, I heard unity. Yeah, we're here, but democracy prevailed today. What are you going to do tomorrow?
Big picture. Where are we in the great art of American history? What are we working out now? What's required to be solved or unknotted or pushed forward? When you look at the patterns of American history, you look at the forces that have battled and intertwined and traded prominence over time. Where are we in the American story right now?
Well, you know, again, I'm a prophet of the past, not of the future, but I was playing around this morning with writing about this era in 100 years, as one does. And I guess if I had to imagine what that would be like, I would say that the years from 2000 to the present have been years in which American democracy was trying to come to grips with what it truly meant to be a multicultural democracy. And that in that passage of time, we have come to a crisis, but it's a crisis that I think we have demographically passed the tipping point. So I know things look terrible right now, and the thing on the Capitol, and you know, the pressure that we're all under, and you know, the backlash and QAnon and coronavirus, but those forces were all in play when they weren't on the table yet. And certainly the crises that the coronavirus is new, but certainly the other crises that pandemics aren't, by the way, they've been around now and we've been taking care of them until this one. But the crises that are now seemingly so wrenching are perhaps simply those patterns, sort of the breaking of the wave on the rocks. But that wave was huge and dangerous before it broke. Once it broke, it's like, you know, surfing. Once the wave breaks, it's very visible, and that's where it's really, you know, people are like, oh my God.
Splash, right.
But it's the building wave that is creating the crisis. So I kind of feel like I'm actually really tired, but I'm also really optimistic that that America's going to figure out how to make a multicultural democracy. I mean, one of the things that really I find fascinating about the 2020 election, and mind you, I could be wrong about this, but it feels to me, and I use the word feels as opposed to done the research for, it feels to me the moment that the Democratic Party finally woke up and said, wait a minute, our base is not white working class men. Our base has been African Americans since the 1960s. Let's act like it. And that right there is a really big shift in terms of American politics and in terms of the way the government works, for someone to say, hey, it's not a question of reclaiming those Reagan Democrats. They have been lost. They're gone. It's a question of rebuilding a new country. And that felt to me like a big shift. So I'm optimistic. It's going to be a hell of a lot of hard work, and I hope I'm allowed to use that word here.
Yes, you are.
But it's, for so many years, it felt like people like me were fighting a holding action, trying to convince people that democracy mattered. And literally people are like, oh, look, you know, she's at it again. And now finally people are like, hey, wait a minute, democracy matters. And it feels like there's a lot of us now who care in a way that they didn't even 5 years ago.
Heather, you're so great. Speaking of waves, you sure have put a lot of people in touch with the Maine coast with your letters from an American. The photographs that you run on your occasional days away from writing are so evocative. I was actually talking this week with Peter Ralston, who's a lot of his photos that you've used, and they're so wonderful. Thanks for putting us in that space.
Isn't Peter great? I didn't realize you knew him.
Well, we used one of his photos as the backdrop to promote this conversation because his photography and your voice have become quite intertwined. I know you use a certain guy called Buddy Poland once in a while. Let's give you credit for him. I think that's your guy, but Lobsterman guy. But Peter's are just so wonderful, and somehow something reassuring about the sturdiness of that Maine coast in the midst of all the storms that we've felt over these last several years.
Peter's photographs are solid. They're absolutely solid. Buddy, my partner is a working lobsterman, so so his are evocative of the actual work.
Yes.
You know, there you feel like you're on the boat, or you feel like
sure
you're
do.
moving the crates around.
Yeah.
And I actually have on occasion used other people's photos and would like to use more photos to broaden out letters. And now that I'm actually getting some sleep, maybe I'll be able to go ahead and do that.
How long are you going to keep up Letters from an American, Heather?
I originally had, I mean, I didn't intend to start them. I originally, about 6 months ago, I promised people that I would go 100 days into the new administration. That's to April 20th, which is an interesting date, 420. But but you know, people really love them, and so at least right now, I expect that I will continue them. One of the things about them is that they were very, very difficult toward the end of the Trump administration because you didn't really know what was going on, and I would spend 6 or 8 hours reading stories from all over, trying to piece together the story, because there'd be a piece here and a piece here and a piece here. So far, the Biden administration, the stories are clear. I mean, it's like, this is happening.
Yes.
And it's sourced. And so you can say, oh, look, they are fighting over the filibuster. Here's what a filibuster is. And so I think I wrote last night's letter in 3 hours, maybe. And 3 hours is entirely doable. 8 is not, because, you know, I have a full-time job as well. So anyway, right now, I'm planning to go on with them. But, you know, maybe I'll bring in other voices. I don't know what I'll do.
It must be easier when you're not in the middle of a Trump tweet storm most of the time.
Oh no, you know what did me in was the fact that, and Buddy's the one who pointed out, they did news dumps after Sean Hannity went off. So like under normal circumstances, the latest news dump you're going to get is at like 6 o'clock, unless there's a tsunami somewhere or something, an act of God. And so you can start writing it at 4 o'clock, and then you can add new stuff at 6 o'clock. But literally we'd have crisis breaking news at like 11:54, and you'd be like, wait a minute, I've been working here for 7 hours. You
Let
can't.
me up.
I bet I've got 100 pages of letters that I never got to use because there would be breaking news and I'd throw everything out and start again. That was the hard part.
Well, you have made a major contribution to a lot of people's sanity, and I think to the steady push for the sustenance, the sustaining of democracy in this last year. And for that, we are very grateful. I don't know how Buddy's schedule has aligned with yours over that time, and I hope they get to line up in perhaps a more peaceful future. But we're really grateful for what you've brought there, the way it's informed not just a whole lot of individual Americans, but I think that the larger discourse, I think it's bled into a much wider range of American journalism over that time. I think you've actually tinted it with your historical context in a way that's very useful. I hope you and Ken Burns have a conversation at some point and produce something together about this remarkable time that we have been through. Not to say we're necessarily out of it, but it was remarkable. And for the moment, there's a feeling of a way forward. The crisis isn't over though, and that's going to take a lot of effort from a lot of people. I personally hope you'll keep your voice going for a long time as a rudder under that effort and that conversation. And I'm so grateful to you over this last year, and again today, for sharing your thoughts and your perspective with us, Heather. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to go ahead and have the opportunity to be part of this American conversation, for sure. And again, what fun it will be to get to rebuild this country.
Yeah, let's see it happen. Heather Cox Richardson, magnificent, wonderful talking with you. Thanks for your being with us today. Wonderful to have you.
Thank you, Tom. Talk to you soon.
Bye for now. Thanks everybody for being with us. Join us again next week. Ashbrook Live, signing out, if I can find the right button here. So long, Heather.